This is Katie, co-host of Coffee with Keith and Katie. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Hi, this is Emily.
This is Lindsay.
And this is Elizabeth,
co-hosts of Beauties and Headcanons here on Public House Media. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Once you are done with this episode, we hope you'll come check out our show, Beauties and Headcanons, where we talk nerdy to you about fandoms, fan fiction, and all pop culture for nerds that you can think of. A new show comes out every Friday.
Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes so you never miss an episode of Beauties and Headcanons. Thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
So what's up, guys? We're so excited to jump into this and just to talk about so many different things with you. First of all, Sarah, I'm just wondering though, how's your week going?
My week's going pretty good.
Yeah, what's new?
It's good. I took a twerking class last night that I was actually really bad at. Yeah.
A twerking?
Twerking? Yeah, like
TW twerking?
Oh yeah, it was called twerkography. So it was a whole like choreographed dance routine based around twerking, and I am not good at that. I like don't know how to move my hips. I just kept moving my knees. And then there was this whole section where we had to do head whipping, like whipping your hair around, and my hair's so long I just kept getting trapped in it. And I was like, this is not good. The way that you twerk like Sarah is you don't move your hips at all. You just wiggle your knees around.
You pretend like you don't have hips at all? Or maybe you don't, do you?
It was embarrassing. I took a video and I watched it of myself later. I was like, oh God, no, like why is this happening? At some point I decided that was a good idea. I'm proud of myself for going. I probably will continue to go, but like, you know, you're learning things. It's fun to do things outside your comfort zone.
No, I'm very proud of you for doing that. I'm serious. I am very proud of you for going and doing something outside of your comfort zone.
And I was by myself in there, you know, so anyway, but it was good. It was good. I'm proud I did it.
Do not downplay that.
No.
I'm serious. No, that's great. It is.
Yeah, you can do it. I believe in you.
Now making a very obvious transition into something that has nothing to do with this. Sarah, I'm wondering, today with our guest that we have coming up for you, we're going to be talking a lot about stigma and a lot about kind of through history, the way that culture has thought about disability throughout time here, specifically in the States. And I know in class, you have learned about social structures and disability. I'm wondering if you can kind of share that with us and give us the kindergarten version of what that looks like.
So one thing I do want to share with you that I found was pretty like revolutionary, and as we were talking earlier, is this article by Goffman, and it came out in 1963. So it's just interesting to think that like this is research that's been around since the 60s, and like these are things that we know, but this is the first time I had understood this concept, and it was pretty powerful to me too to be like, this is what I'm experiencing. So this is Goffman's idea on social stigma around disability. So he talks about, and he's a sociologist, and he talks about having this identity that like if someone has a disability, then they have this sort of like different body, that then there's these two groups. There's the in-group alignment, and then there's the out-of-group alignment are the terms that he's using. So it's sort of this like in-group and out-group.
I almost pictured it as I was reading it as like two circles, and then one circle was in-group and the other circle was out of group.
Yeah. So then someone with a disability is put in the out group by the people who are quote unquote normals. And the person with the disability then experiences what it's like to be in the out of group. And then they have a choice that needs to be made. Do they disguise their disability and pretend to be normal to try to fit into the normal group? Or do they take on the social stigmas that's identified with the out of group because they're not in with the normal? So this person is not normal. They're considered sort of more less than by society. And so they can take on those social limitations. So that's like a first choice that's presented that it sort of seems like.
So sorry to interrupt here. But for me, that presents in a way where the disability that we have, we very, very much can pass as able-bodied in many, many life situations. Yeah. So for me growing up, I, all of the time, was really choosing to identify as able-bodied. I didn't realize that that's what I was doing, but I was intentionally hiding the fact that I had one hand. I very much was doing everything that I could to be in the circle that was the in group. I had no interest in being out of group, although I didn't know that those were the words for it at the time. But anytime I would feel like a social outcast, specifically because of my disability, I would work to find ways to cover that up or to hide that or to do things that would put me back in the circle that was the in group.
Absolutely. And I would agree in most circumstances. And then in other ones, I also felt that I would take on some of the identities and being an outcast. And I had like terrible insecurities. Sure. And I would take on that, like, I am this less than subgroup, which is not a great place to be. So then Goffman also talks about how then another thing that comes up with people in this out of group is that they can reach this sort of like heightened social awareness where they can realize that these are all sort of stigmas that have been placed on this out of group and that they in fact are worthy, if you will, and that they can in fact be part of just regular group, that these limitations being placed on them are not, I mean, like accurate or true, or they're just limitations that society built. So they can reach this sort of like heightened social awareness and then can come back and educate the quote unquote normals to be like, hey, actually, I'm a pretty cool person in society and you should probably accept me. And like, we can do neat things. Like, and I'm this person with disability, like this disability aspect doesn't matter as much as it is like, I'm still a worthwhile human to be here. And it's interesting because they become more enlightened than the people in the norm group, right? So then they can educate the normals, if you will, to then sort of build this more inclusive society. And it's interesting because I really felt that these different groups that was happening and sort of what was going on in these different contexts. And that's a lot of like emotional effort and a lot of like emotional regulation that comes in to be able to achieve that heightened awareness. And that's not something that is necessarily fair, if you will, to ask of everyone with a disability, because that's a lot of work and effort that has to go on. Whereas it then seems like going back to this in group of the normals are like, okay, cool, like you're accepted. But there's so much growth and so much like underplay and like under just like effort and time and like self-awareness that needs to happen for that person to be able to achieve that awareness, that heightened self-awareness, to then have to then teach other groups in society too, which is a lot. That's a lot. And that's a lot of pressure to ask of a 10-year-old, right? And that's a lot of, and sometimes people who are then placed in the out of group category don't necessarily ever reach that. And those are personal choices that comes up to that. Also too, Nikki, I want to come back to this idea of hiding, because I feel like there's both the physical action of hiding disability, if that's something that is hideable, if you will. I know some disabilities are less quote unquote hideable, but I also think that there's like a social and emotional hiding of the disability within yourself and just like not acknowledging it or not discussing about different features that are unique to that disability, particularly for people who don't have strong communities where other people have disabilities too. Because I feel like both you and I have kind of talked about too, and maybe you guys feel it too, where like there's a lot of things you're experiencing with having a disability, but I never talked about them. I don't think I ever started talking about them until I was like 22. So I feel like that's almost like hiding that disability within myself by not acknowledging what that means.
For sure. I think at least growing up, I understood that something was a little bit different, but it was my everyday, right? So it was my normal. And I think it took me kind of becoming an adult person and becoming really introspective and asking questions of others and kind of digging into social constructs to understand that my everyday was indeed different. You know, not everybody gets a second look when they're just walking in a crowd, but I do. Because I have a physical difference. And, you know, there are all these little things that to me were just so normal, which is yet again the beauty of having this disability. We can have the disability and live normally, and that is our normal.
Right.
But I did not fully understand the impact until I really started being honest with myself in the fact that the world was treating me differently than most other people. So,
absolutely. So that's what I'm hoping that we're doing here with that podcast.
Our guest is John Kramer. He was one of my professors at Boston University. He taught a course that was called The Economic and Political Factors That Influence Occupational Therapy Practice. And it was really beautiful because he was one of the first individuals to introduce to me a lot of these concepts that we sort of talk about in disability and like really introduce me to disability research, which is fascinating. And I love it. He is experienced in qualitative research design, implementation, and analysis. John is currently working at the State Systems Research Team at the Institute for Community Inclusion, acronym is ICI, at the University of Massachusetts at Boston on systems change and employment issues for people with disabilities. John also earned his PhD in disability studies from the University of Illinois at Chicago. So I'd love to do a warm welcome for John Kramer. Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about the term disability. What are sort of the connotations that are included with this language, and how has this changed over time?
It's a big question, and I think one of the things about disability is it's been defined in different ways over really through history, and it depends on really how far back I guess you want to go. Societies have in the past have had very wide-ranging beliefs about people with disabilities, ranging from, this is kind of the classic sense is, this is a curse from God, somehow we sinned and the disability is kind of a punishment for that. Other cultures thought like this is a divine offer, divine kind of thing, like they were closer to God. They were viewed kind of in a very kind of mystical, religious kind of connotation. I think more recently, as science and specifically kind of medical science kind of improved, scientists really started to, and doctors really started to try to classify different types of disability. And so you started to see doctors talking about, scientists and doctors trying to figure out which kinds of people with disabilities can we educate versus which kinds of people with disabilities are so severe that we can't educate, or which kinds of people can function in kind of the workforce, the mainstream kind of capitalist societies, that industrial societies that emerged, and really they started to kind of name those different types of disabilities and to start to separate them out.
Right. And I think I remember that from your classwork too, that people when the Industrial Revolution happened, sort of in the United States, that people with disabilities were less likely to be efficient with all of the things that were happening, and they weren't quote unquote like as fast as people who didn't necessarily have disabilities. So they weren't able to work those jobs and then be able to generate income for themselves, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's, we're kind of covering this with a fairly wide brush. It's complicated, but yes, generally in the U.S. anyway, U.S. really started as kind of an agrarian, farm-based economy, right? And when people who were maybe what we would now call, intellectually disabled, or were a little slow back then, they were farmhands. They still helped on the farm. People lived out in the country. People knew each other. The communities were small. There was a sense that life pace was a little bit slower, right? And then as the Industrial Revolution hit, that really changed kind of the needs for labor. All of a sudden, instead of having, more manual labor type positions, you needed people who had pretty fine motor skills, like they had to have, like, adhere to the assembly line, right? Like they had to really know kind of the technology and how their role within kind of the factory really fit together. And so as part of that, people started really moving and concentrating in cities, and that's where you see the populations of cities explode. And there's kind of it created a very different experience for people with disabilities. It created a group of people who didn't necessarily fit into the kind of what the labor market needed at the time. In the US, kind of the first big move was to educating, for example, people who are deaf and hard of hearing. It's like, it seems shocking that it took mid 1800s, to realize like, hey, you can educate people who can't hear. So attitudes started to change for certain kinds of people. There was like a lot of optimism that, oh, we can cure disability, we can get people with disabilities kind of back to function and kind of incorporated in society. But then as we started to realize, like, not all kinds of bodies are the same, some people really can't function in that way, there started to become more of a pessimism about what was possible for people. And then, of course, you start to see science starting to try to work backwards and prevent disability, and you started to kind of look at the rise of eugenics in the US, of course, which I think probably most of us are fairly familiar with. Obviously the culminating kind of eugenics disaster was in obviously Nazi Germany, but it really had its start in the US with kind of the classifications of different kinds of disability and trying to determine their heritability. And there was a sense that, if you prevented the wrong people from, having children, you could cut down or eradicate disability. They even extended it to social behavior. There was a lot of concern around kind of people who did not crime and how that came associated with disability. So I would say, to answer your question, things kind of started kind of optimistic, but then I think as they realized, like, science couldn't quite describe or solve the issues that disability presented, there started to become more, I think, some more pessimism about it, at least through eugenics.
That's so scary. I know that, personally for us, they're starting, when Sarah and I were born, it wasn't possible, or almost all of the time, our parents didn't know that we were going to be born with some sort of difference. So now parents are learning earlier and earlier and earlier in the ultrasounds that their child may have, specifically in our case, one hand. And the earlier that they learn that, the earlier the option is for termination. And that, to me, is just horrifying, that we're living in a world where potentially a Sarah or a myself is being chosen to, just out of pure ignorance, to be totally just not able to even be an option or to be born. I think the thing that I personally am kind of keen into, as you're talking about these different waves and these different kind of social movements about disability, is the continuing pattern that there is something to be fixed. And once I feel like you educate yourself on what disability means and kind of the way in which different disabilities interact with the world, it really is just about, there's nothing to fix. It's just a matter of removing barriers. I guess my question is, when did that shift come along? Has that always been there with certain groups? Is that a newly found kind of wave that we're starting to realize?
I think beliefs about disability are kind of generational, and they take a long time to really change. I mean, if you think about, in some ways things have gotten a lot better for people with disabilities in general. We don't send people to, well, there's still institutions, but we don't warehouse people in institutions like we used to. There's not as much shame for somebody with a difference in their body, like an obvious difference in their body. You can walk around the street. I mean, you still get looks, sometimes, but it's, I can't imagine that it's the same as it was, 50 years ago, where you'd be ostracized and shunned.
Right. Well,
it's
Nikki and I were talking too, that even my life, like in 2013, I was hired to be a flight attendant. Like, I would not have been allowed to be a flight attendant in the 70s. Like, and that's not that much of a time difference, right? That's maybe 40 years.
That's basically yesterday.
Yeah. So it's interesting to see how much we have come from there, that like in 2013, 2018, that I'm able to maintain a position of being a flight attendant, that I was even being able to be thought of as a candidate to go through interviews prior to even showing that I can, in fact, open up the doors or whatever, all the different things that I need to do as being a flight attendant. But I think of that too.
Right. But when you think about the use of language and, epithets that we hear people call each other names and stuff, moron, idiot, those kinds of things. I mean, those only exist because those were medical diagnoses for people with, intellectual and developmental disabilities, back during, really dating from the eugenics days, so like that stuff is still with us. But you're right. Like, I mean, employers now do include disability. Well, first of all, employers value diversity more now than they have in previous generations. And the really great employers also include disability as kind of part of that, definition of diversity. So I think things have definitely gotten better, for a lot of people with disabilities. I think there's still some groups that, really struggle.
Do you think too with things like having a medical diagnosis of being an idiot and then generalizing that to, because I think at one point, like that is the medical term. And I'm sure that medical terms that we're using today that we see are appropriate as medical terms will then sort of develop this negative social connotation to them. And then that's then used in a derogatory sense to then that's what takes on the meaning of that word instead of the original medical diagnosis. So then we also have to grow our words too with our definitions. Is that sort of what I'm hearing too?
Yeah, I mean, there are people who you could probably invite on your show who would be able to much more in depth kind of speak about the history of the language and how that has changed. And, I can certainly kind of help think through some of those options. But, one of the things I think if you learn the history of disability is to be, doctors don't know everything, and doctors don't make the language that they have used for some of their diagnoses it's not very clear, not very helpful from just a pure scientific perspective, so one of the reasons why those words fell out of favor is because they were scientifically kind of not helpful. I mean, they just weren't helpful. They didn't tell you anything that would actually help describe the person. That was one of the great failures of eugenics, was just scientifically not sound, and it didn't actually help to improve. First, it didn't help it didn't help society. It didn't improve people's health, and it actually was a source of a lot of great suffering. Not just, for a long period of time for vulnerable people. And so, I think being skeptical of the power of medicine, I think, was an important part of the story too.
Right, because we're almost fighting for our own existence, right? And that, there's oftentimes we'll talk. All of us have talked to different people in our lives, but that comes to what happened, and I've been explaining things to different people. And I remember I was on a flight and I was working with someone, and she was like, well, it's not like anyone would want this. And it was a really hard question for me to answer, because it's well, but this is also my life. This is my life and this is my experience. And I'm fighting for my existence also. And that I do have this aspect of me. And there's lots of people that do have these different features of themselves and of their bodies. And I do feel like I'm worthy to be here. And I feel like I am worthy to take up space.
Yes.
But is this something that people would want? That's a hard ethical question, even for me to sort of navigate as well. And that I didn't necessarily know how to respond to her, because my initial reaction was well, no, I'm here. I'm worthy to be here. So I should be wanted. But I suppose if you had an option to not live this life, would you? I don't know. That's a higher level question that's not necessarily here, but.
Or there's a deeper question about what gives human beings the idea that they think they can control all those outcomes. I don't know that that's something. What gives us the reason? Why do we think that we should? This is a subject of science fiction novels, and lots of different things are out. It's when we start designing babies, and start determining their genetics. What are we really? Are we playing God? Are we determining? Will there be unintended consequences? Are there unintended ethical issues that arise from those decisions? Who gets to make those decisions? Who has the money to make those decisions? There's a whole lot of really thorny questions.
What strikes kind of a fire in my mind as we're talking about this is, is it okay to play God? And that's clearly, I think we can acknowledge that's more or less a path that we're starting to go down, and that science is starting to go down. And I am somebody who grew up in a very traditional Christian home in a very small rural town in the middle of America, Iowa. And so it's fascinating, as I grew up in a culture where I was reading about Jesus, and Jesus was somebody who was looking to fix people like me, that I had something that was wrong. And so the idea that you can go in and play God and really yes, I guess it comes back to even what I was saying before, fixing whatever it is that is broken. That really is a very philosophical question. Man, just is
it's a very religious kind of way of approaching it, and it's certainly something that, it's still with us. We talk about, there are a lot of churches and people of faith who still view disability as, a punishment from God. And, there's a lot of faiths that, you should, God determines what happens, like if you interfere with that, then you're going against God, like that. It's not like we have gotten past that completely, we haven't gotten past that in the year 2019, so a lot of people still make their decisions, and values based off of that kind of belief system.
I'm wondering, I want to be respectful of your time, John, and I guess I'm wondering, to close, you maybe can speak to perhaps what you're seeing in our current climate, and perhaps maybe where we're going. What trends are you seeing in our social structures? What things do we need to kind of really work to fix? What are good things? What are bad things? Just kind of like a general, where are we at?
I think we are in a time where, at least in the US, there's a lot of stress on some of the kind of hallmark disability programs that people have really relied on. I feel like, frankly, there's been stress on them ever since I can remember. Ever since I remember, I have two brothers who have disabilities, and they're twins. And I feel like it's been a lifelong kind of thing. I do think that there feels like in the last maybe 5 or 6 years that the stakes are getting a little higher, especially when it comes to like the Medicaid program. There was, I think, some optimism about the impact that the Affordable Care Act would have on people with disabilities, particularly with states who opted into the Medicaid expansion. But I think it's definitely helped, but I don't know. I think there's a lot of nervousness about the future there. I think there's a lot of optimism about, one thing we didn't talk about in the class, Sarah, was, the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act, some of the restructuring. If you wanted to get a kind of a cutting edge policy discussion, I would definitely consider that one. But that one's really focused on improving employment outcomes, employment for people with disabilities. It's not clear, like that was one of the last things that the Obama administration did. And I don't know that, I think they might just be starting to, I think we were just talking about it at work the other day, is like, I think they're just starting to see, on the impact of it, but it's still kind of early because it takes a while for the data to be analyzed and to look at. I think from my families and, one of the things in disability is there's always been a real kind of tension between, people with disabilities and their families. I think there are a lot of, at least in the population, the population of people, the people that I know, they're getting older. Parent movement, the ones who really deinstitutionalize people, they're the elders now, and like they're not going to be around for that much longer. It's not clear that next generations are quite very well equipped to take on some of those roles. And one of the things I also, particularly with, for me, like for siblings, it is personal, like you two are talking about your personal experience. It is personal for me too. I also think one of the interesting, maybe less obvious things is, some of the stuff in the news around privacy, online privacy, and what does that mean, for really everybody, but for people with disabilities, it's a really thorny issue. And it's kind of interesting because I've seen this pop up at a few different talks now. It's like disability advocates kind of having an interesting kind of take on it. It's like, well, people with disabilities have had to give up their privacy for forever. So why is everybody making a big deal about online privacy? Like this idea that, that people with disabilities are using like Facebook and social media and online tools as a way to build solidarity with each other and to seek support. So I don't know. It's hard to argue with that, but like, I think that we don't really know the full, like to really make an informed consent, you have to know the benefits and the costs, right? And I'm not sure that as a society we really understand the costs of giving up privacy as much as we have. And so it's hard for me. I feel like I tend to be a little more, whoa, everybody needs to stop getting on social media. Like I tend to go on that kind of route, but I can totally understand. I mean, I'm on a sibling support group on Facebook that's 4,000 or 5,000 people now. It's growing every day, and a lot of people use that to get routed to support in their communities, and you don't want to cut that off either. I think it would be an interesting issue to explore. I'm not sure a lot of people are talking about that yet, but I think it will become, especially when people start getting concerned about kind of medical records and, what does it mean to disclose? I think about it in employment circles too. An employer checks your social media, what does that mean for a person with a disability?
You actually speak to something that is very is a huge part of specifically my life, because I for sure am somebody who has been very vocal on social media, and I've found that it's I don't have a historically all disabled college to go to teach me pride of disability. I don't have a church to go to every Sunday that's instilling the pride in me either. I've found my pride by connecting with my community online, right? Mm-hmm. So I have specifically been somebody who has been very vocal and, very much in the forefront. But what does that mean in my professional life? It's not what I do 24/7. And yet I have to, that part of my public life, I just have to be okay with the rest of the world always knowing. So any employer that I go to, it's always a part of the conversation. By the way, I do this advocacy. And yes, if you search me, you will find all of these things about me. And so it's interesting because I really have had to accommodate my life around the fact that disability and talking about it is important enough to me that I'm willing to compromise and have those conversations in my everyday professional life. I've never thought about it as privacy. I feel that, I guess, is what I'm saying. I feel it.
Well, and even little things too. And yes, that's a large conversation to have, especially if the job position that you're looking for really has nothing to do with the sort of disability platform of the disability world, because you're a human that needs to work and make whatever, or find those things, because that's how it works. I know that one of the first jobs that I was interviewed through, again, sort of, I'm assuming had found out that I was born with a limb difference, and I was a phone interview that I had with her for a position. At one point in it, she's like, so tell me, what do you have a disability? Which, and that goes into questions that you're supposed to ask and not ask at interviews. But she was like, do you have to have a special keyboard? Because if you do, I don't have a budget for that. And it was a very negative interaction, and a very, I hadn't navigated that before at all. And I didn't know what to do. And I was, 19, 20 when I was trying to get this position. So it was pretty early on. But yes, I could see that too, that sort of has a backlash. But also not wanting to not be proud of who I am and not wanting to connect with that too. Yeah. That is an interesting ground. Or how can I be able to use that? Or how can we, not just me, but you and everyone that sort of, and everywhere that has anything sort of in relation to disability, that is something to both be proud of, but then isn't tainted if we are looking for employment positions, or if we're looking for or any type of thing in which that could be exploited and be taken advantage of.
Yeah.
And that is a very real conversation.
There are a lot of interesting discussions there, and it's kind of, for people who are vulnerable. I mean, it's not a new topic, it's people are vulnerable, but they should still you don't want to protect, you don't want to shelter them and keep them from experiencing life. But on the other hand, it's not the same as somebody who doesn't have that vulnerability, participating in public spaces.
I am very thankful for you taking the time for us today. I appreciate you being willing to jump in with us and being willing to kind of not only draw some broad strokes with us, but also then engage us in random conversation as we are personally relating it back to our world and our experience. It's important to us in this podcast, just, so John, that we're acknowledging the fact that we are 20-somethings, we are white girls, and we come from a very specific cross-section of disability. And we know that. So what's just important to us is we know that we can only be really real about what we've experienced and trying to kind of relate it back to the whole. So I appreciate you allowing us to jump in and relate in the ways that we can. And for taking the time to join us. It was a pleasure to meet you virtually today.
Nice to meet you as well. And good luck with your future podcast. Let me know if there's anything I can help with.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
We want to give special thanks to our network, Public House Media. For our intro beats, Jason Barnes at Cybernetics. For our logo art, Patrice, you can find him at normalpersons.com. And Matt Meldrum and Ryan Louie, our two-handed technical team. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts or publichousemedia.org. Follow us on Twitter at DisarmDisable. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Disarming Disability. And check out our website, disarmingdisability.com. See you next week. Bye.